Have you ever wondered how property developers in Spain actually operate, how they find land, price projects, and how they sell? Stay tuned. This is the stuff they don't tell you and may surprise you. Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Costa Insights together with Kian. Today, we're going to be discussing the following topics with respect to developers. How developers find land, feasibility and numbers, how developers control inventory, design amenities and what sells, the real sales process, developer mistakes and red flags, and advice for buyers looking at new builds. Kian, should we just get straight into it?
Let's go.
Let's take it from the top. Tell us about how property developers in Spain, and specifically on the Costa del Sol, go about finding land to build on.
Okay, so let's start with differentiating kind of developers, right? In Spain you have developers that do different things. So you've got developers which are the larger ones, build big apartment blocks, big communities, and then you've got developers that do sort of individual villas, individual properties, maybe a few townhouses. So we have to differentiate between the larger ones, the ones that do bigger developments, and the ones that do, let's say, single homes and so on. When it comes to the single home developers, they have it a lot easier than the big developers because there's a lot more land for let's say single house villas in Spain. Again, this depends where you are.
Smaller footprints.
Exactly. Yeah. It's a lot easier to find a plot to build a 300 square meter home on than it is to find a plot for 100 apartments. No? So when we talk about developers, the developers that do villas, they have it a lot easier than the larger developers. The larger developers, like Neinor, Aedas, Kronos, developers that operate all over Spain, or even local developers that develop apartments, are the ones that have it the hardest. In Spain, it's very difficult to find what we call in Spain suelo finalista, right? There's a lot of suelo is land, a lot of land which can become residential for plurifamiliar, which means for apartment blocks or a lot of townhouses.
Multifamily.
Exactly. Plurifamiliar is multifamily, exactly.
Yeah.
So, but it's very hard to find land which basically is ready for you to apply for a building license and start building. Okay. So they have a very, very hard time. Developers, rely on their network of agents which are specialized in finding these sort of lands. And apart from being hard, there is a scarcity of these lands. Spain has a problem with bureaucracy. So it's a lot of these lands which are in process to be finalized as final urban lands. Bureaucracy can take 10, 15 years. So, what comes out and is available to build on relatively quickly is like a nectar. It's very difficult to get hands on these lands. So developers proper fight to get their hands on them. That's one of the problems in Spain, the bureaucracy to get land available to be built on. But, let's say that developers come to market and they find land that is ready to apply a building license and ready to sort of build. First of all, it's very difficult. But second, it's becoming more and more expensive. There's a term which we call repercusión de metro cuadrado en suelo, which is a bit of a mouthful, but basically means how much developers are ready to pay per square meter buildable, right? So in easy terms, if you have a land of 10,000 square meters and you can build 1,000 square meters of multi-property or 1,000 square meters of multi-family property, well, you're going to be paying in relation to that. So, at the moment, developers in Spain are paying sometimes above 1,000 euros per square meter on the metro repercusión del techo, no? So that's quite remarkable. A few years back, it was more, in the line of 800. We've seen people pay above 1,000, depending on where they are. So finding land is very, very hard. It's very, very hard.
Is there an online database that everybody can access in order to be able to see which land is buildable, which one is not?
No.
But surely there has to be something which shows which areas are buildable.
Yeah, well, the areas that are buildable are defined by the PGOU of each town hall. So every town hall defines what land is buildable. But another thing is the database of what's for sale. That doesn't exist. The thing is, it's not the same to talk about the coast than it is Albacete or inside Spain, where accessing land banks here on the coast is quite difficult. Accessing land banks or options for sale in lands is easier.
So are there such things as like land scouts where the developers have these agents that go out and sort of feel the market and figure out like where the plots are, and how do they go about actually finding those plots?
Totally.
If there's no online database, how do these scouts go about doing it?
Totally. So it's basically agencies and agents which are specialized in big land banks, and they even developers even pay finders fee to these agencies to find them. It's a super specialized role.
All right, Kian, let's move on to the second question. When do they say yes? They find the land, But what makes a developer say, yeah, this is worth building our next development on?
So developers need to believe in the concept. They need to, understand the absorption rate of the market. Also, like, depends what they're. I think the first thing is they need to understand, who's their end buyer, right? It's very different to develop a coastal development in Marbella, Costa del Sol, than it is to develop a, product or development that's focused on the national buyer somewhere in Sevilla. No, so it's very, very different, and it depends on sort of plot to plot. The moment that the developer understands who that sort of end consumer is, who that end buyer is, they build a concept around it. And then when they have that entire concept, they work backwards on how much are we able to sell this for. No, developers generally in Spain, when we go back to the single development home, so developers that build a house rather than apartment complexes, normally in renovation, flips, or building a house, the thumb rule for, let's say, their profit margins on feasibility and so on is 33% to acquire the property, 33% in cost of construction and renovation, and then 33% profit. That's very, very generic, but that's the way it works in the smaller developments. In the larger developments, it's more like 20% margin. Again, the larger the value of the development, the thinner the margin. That's the way it works.
Kian, tell us about how developers actually go about financing the developments.
Okay, so excluding the smaller developers, again, and just talking about the big ones, right? What people don't realize is that, many, many years ago, we're talking 15, 20, 25 years ago, the developer figure would be, normally a family developer, that have been developing for 10 years, always use their own cash, their own money. But in today's market, these developers are different beasts.
Yeah, they're institutions now.
They're institutions. Yeah. So if you look at like AEDAS, you look at Neynor, you look at these massive companies, Kronos.
Sometimes publicly traded.
They are no longer developers in that sense. They have big investment funds behind them. So how do they finance? It's very simple. These developers basically go out to market, they source the land, they buy the land with their own cash, right? And then they will develop a concept, they will develop a project, spend some money on architects, on conceptualization of what they're going to be creating, and then they'll bring the development to market, and they'll need to have a certain amount of sales in order to then approach the bank and then say to the bank, hey, Mr. Bank, I bought this land, I developed this concept, and I've now sold 30% pre-license. I'd like you to finance the build for me. And that's how they finance the build. And that's what a lot of people don't sort of, aside of real estate, aside of developments that people don't see, is that banks use bank finance, generally speaking, to develop their own projects. There are a few exceptions to the rules. For example, like there are some developers like TM in Spain, which is still it's a massive developer, but it's still a family sort of run business, and they sort of build without selling. And that's something quite unique. There are some companies that develop without selling, and a lot of the development companies, especially the big ones, they don't start building until they've sold a certain amount of properties and then are able to access finance with the bank. What I'm trying to say is people need to understand that these big developers, yes, they're developers, but they act more like big funds than developers. They're massive institutions.
Yeah. So that's when a project gets launched, and you speak to one of the agents at homes, for example, and it says, this is maybe, the building license has yet to be approved. It's not anything to be worried about. It's going to get approved. It's just it's part of the sort of the financing process, right?
Well, I mean, they hope to get a license. Basically, like the way it works is the land has a buildable capacity. So the developer makes a project in line with what's allowed there, and then waits for the building license. And in the initial stages, what tends to happen, it's not always the case. Not all new construction properties or not all off-plan developments are a good deal, right? But in the case of, for example, a few of these big investment funds, what they do is they'll bring the 30% of the options to market. They'll sell, 30% at a very competitive price, and clients will go, well, how are they even making money on these units? Well, the purpose of those units is not to make money on them. It's actually to secure financing with the bank. And what they lose on those units is what they'll make on the units at the end. Yeah, right?
Yeah. So that's why you'll see sort of scaled pricing as more 100%. And more units get released to the market.
But it depends on the area. Like if you look at some prime location developments, you won't even find competitive pricing. So it really depends on the area, it depends on the developer. Like if you go into the Golden Mile, we've seen some developments sell practically at market price off plan. So I think it depends what developments you're talking about.
But there are developers, I think you just touched on it, that wait until the building license has been granted before they start commercializing.
For example, Taylor Wimpey. So
Exactly,
Taylor
the
Wimpey,
one I had in mind.
Taylor Wimpey is very prudent, let's say, when it comes to developing. They get everything ready and they only start commercializing the units the moment that they have the building license in place. And that's good, you know, it's good. If you had to define it, it's better. But, you know, people that enter into these developments where they're 10 months away or 9 months away from building license and then a further 24 months away from completion, I think that if your expectations, if you know that it's going to take that long, well, it's fine, you know?
But I mean, Taylor Wimpey is the exception on the market. I'd say the majority of the developers launch pre-building license.
Yeah. Taylor Wimpey, I
part.
think TM also sometimes launch with building license. But yeah, Taylor Wimpey is definitely the one.
Okay, let's move on to the next topic.
Yeah.
How developers control inventory. So one thing people don't realize is just how strategic developers are with the sales of the stock that they have, right? So tell us a little bit about how units are released to the market. What are maybe what's the strategy or the different strategies that developers, you know, what kind of approaches they take?
This is a really interesting topic, and people don't realize how complex it is. You know, if you look at our team of High Homes rock stars, right? They are constantly out and about showing properties, and it's not about knowing, you know, what's for sale in the development. It's about knowing what still has to come to market, right? And knowing the inventory developer has left behind closed doors. Developers will sell a big percentage of their properties in the pre-launch stages, depending again what developer we're talking about, but that's normally how it goes. They'll sell 20, 30% in order to access finance, right? And then they've got a steady 24 months until completion. And their, let's say, objective is to sell out in a slow motion. Really like, you know, three properties here, 3 properties a month, 2 properties a month. They don't, it's sort of counterintuitive. People, you go, well, if they sell everything up now, well, it'll be better for them, right? Well, no, because these developers will have construction contracts with, for example, these big contracting companies, and these contracting companies will price, you know, a project, but materials, for example, will be priced on the go. So you can't close prices for construction a year from now. So, for example, if plasterboards are, I don't know, 20 euro per square meter, and by the time, you know, you're 1 year into construction, it's 25 euro per square meter, and you've locked your sort of revenue stream because you can't sell the properties again because you've already sold them all out, and, you know, construction prices go up, you might end up sort of, you know, first making less money, but sometimes even risking losing money, right? That happened in COVID. So like with COVID, a lot of developers had a very hard time, you know.
Because the global supply chain was messed up.
So global supply chain was messed up. Prices of the materials skyrocketed. They had 80% of the project sold out. They didn't have any way to maneuver. They had no way to defend themselves. So since COVID, developers went, whoa. I've already got 25% sold out in the pre-launch phases. Now, until completion, I want a steady flow of sales, 3 sales, 4 sales a month. So they will then in turn make sure that they don't release everything. So if you look at the price list, you'll see there's only 4 units available. That does not mean there's only 4 for sale, everything's sold out. It means that a lot of what is for sale is held back because they don't want to sell everything at once.
Okay, next topic.
Yeah.
Design, amenities, and what sells. We've seen a lot of new developments go all out with amenities, resort style living and such, co-working spaces, rooftop pools. Is this what buyers want, or is it just marketing?
It's I think it is what buyers want. It depends on what buyers we're talking about. National buyers might not be very bothered about it, but, you know, international community comes over to relocate, that wants the services, you know, want healthy lifestyle, want an on-site gym. They do want this, and they'll pay more per square meter for those properties because they offer those services, right? But the interesting thing here, putting the spotlight on the developer, is how much does it cost the developer to do that, right? People don't understand that if you've got a land and you've got X square meters you can build on, if you're giving up 500 square meters or 600 square meters to amenities, you are, you know, practically losing the option of selling another 6 units, right? So what's this?
Huge opportunity cost.
It's huge, exactly. So, you know, if you say every unit, let's say it sacrificed 5 apartments and every apartment sells for 500,000, well, that's 2.5 million euros in revenue lost.
That's a lot.
So at the end, developers go, okay, what's more important for me? You know, do I build out maximum amount of square meters of apartments and then not give so many amenities? Or do I, you know, use 500 square meters for amenities and then put some of that sort of lost potential on the apartment? So
who makes that call?
The developer ultimately. I think the developer pays attention to the market, and they don't really have an option again, depending which market we talk about. But if you come to Stepona and you come to us, right, and you say to us, I want to build a project of 60 apartments in New Golden Mile, and I want to just do apartments with a pool and a garden. Like, the first thing I would say to that developer is like, you're crazy. Like, you need to compete with the market, and everyone in your market has a indoor pool. Everyone in your market has a gym. Everyone has sort of outdoor yoga area, co-working.
Standing out. It's about like there's a minimum standard.
In certain markets, that is the minimum standard in Estepona. But if you go to the other side of Malaga, well, you won't find that, right? Like, it really depends what markets you're in.
And who decides, what the homes should look and feel like?
The developer, and this is where a figure comes into play, which is called the master broker, right? So the master broker is the company that takes care of the exclusive sales of a development for the developer. Developers don't usually handle the sales, except some cases. They normally sort of subcontract that service and give that obligation to someone else, right? The master broker is generally the entity or the company that understands the market really well. Because developers, the only thing they know how to do is to buy land and develop. They're going to be dealing with the headaches of the contractors. They don't want to deal with with the commercial side of things. They just want to basically get someone to sell their product. So they use master brokers. Master brokers in Spain, the market's very fragmented. So you have, for example, in Costa del Sol, there are thousands of agencies. In Costa Blanca, the same thing. In Costa Brava, the same thing. So how do you channel your product in the market? Well, you need to use a master broker to make sure that everyone has exposure to your market. If you wanted to work with 1,000 agencies individually, you'd go crazy. So that's why the figure of master broker works. So that master broker is the person that has enough market knowledge to inform the developer what to do or what not to do. So in this case,
from a design perspective.
Exactly.
That's
So
a big,
together with their designers, together with developers, they'll go, you need to do this concept. So, for example, how big the square meter of living room should be, what the minimum size of a terrace is, Don't forget, like, depending on the developer style, the more apartments they cram into a development, the more money they make, right?
Yeah.
So here is where a master broker might go, hey, the concept of this development should be larger living rooms. So you're going to do less units, but you're going to have more quality, or outdoor space is important. This sort of quality, this sort of finish, and that's the figure that is really going to help. It's a triangle, really. You have the developer, the master broker, and the designers and architects, and all those people together come up with the concept. Essentially, it's the developer that makes the call based on the feedback he gets from all these different people.
Okay, let's move on to the next topic, Kian. The real sales process. Help us understand, what role do agencies like ours, High Homes, play in the kind of the commercialization of these developments on the Costa del Sol specifically?
So within the coast, there are, like we said earlier, it's a very fragmented coast. So you have different real estate agencies that do different things, right? So in our case, we bring qualified buyers to the master broker and facilitate sort of buyers accessing that product. With such a fragmented market, you have agencies which specialize, for example, in Scandinavian clients. You have agencies that specialize in, Italian clients, right? So these master brokers make sure that every single agency has their product on their books. In our case, where we help a lot of clients from the US, Canada, Northern Europe, Belgium, and Holland, and England and Ireland. And we help our clients navigate the market. And, as part of our service, we'll bring them across these developments. So that's the role we play, making sure that we put the development on the client's radar.
Kian, for people that are interested in buying off-plan, are there any advantages to them going direct to the developer or the master broker instead of working through an agency like High Homes?
There's financially, from, let's say, a purchase price perspective, there's no difference. So you buy a property with a developer through High Homes, or you buy it directly with a developer, there's no difference.
Would they save on commission, for example?
No, because the developers will sell at that price, and include those in the price that you see. There is a sales commission if they sell it with an agency or they don't. So it doesn't make a difference at all. Now, for buyers that come to market that are working with agencies, it's always better to work with an agency. And the reason I say that is an agency is going to give you an impartial view of that development. When you can offer 10 developments, it doesn't really matter which one which one your client ends up buying, you can actually give an impartial view on why you think that development works, right? If you're working directly with the person that is selling the product, it's a bit more of a biased approach. So I recommend clients to always buy through agencies because it makes zero difference on the purchase price.
Would you consider advantageous, in fact, to work through an agency? Because if you inquire on a development and you think that you'd like it, but when you actually go and visit, you don't, that you then have access to the entire market of developments.
You can also compare. Not all agencies work new developments, right? So most of agencies are do resale properties, right? But when it comes to new developments, I think when you're comparing one development to the other, it's important to count on the experience that your agent has within the new development market. Like for example, with our clients, we give them actual feedback on what we think of finishings, for example. Like we will say, when clients ask me, for example, on, hey, what do you think about the finishings of Taylor Wimpey compared to the finishings of this developer, right? We can actually give you, based on our experience, where we think these developers are in terms of finishings, in terms of after sales, who's the best when it comes to snagging, who's the worst for PBC, which is the money laundering process that needs to happen with all these. So we can actually give you real feedback based on our experience. And I think that's what an agent or a new development agent brings to this sort of situation and is terribly, massively advantageous to a buyer.
Okay, let's move on to the next topic, Kian. We're going to discuss developer mistakes and red flags. So you've been in the market for a long time. You've worked with developers of all shapes and sizes. What are the biggest mistakes you've seen, and what red flags should buyers be aware of?
So one of the biggest mistakes that we've seen in the recent sort of years is how they bring their product to market in the initial stages. So developers will want to sell out a certain amount before they get a building license in order to get access to bank finance. And what tends to happen is they'll bring product to market cheaper or normally at a lower value than market price. No? And what has happened recently with a few developments, without naming any names, where developers have brought, for example, a price list of 30 units out for sale at once, and then the master broker has distributed that through their agencies, and then all of a sudden you've got 20 agencies knocking on the door because there's a pent-up demand for that product, and it just ends up in tears. Like a lot of clients, for example, can't get in for a viewing until 12 on the launch day, and then from 10 to 12, 5 have sold. The developer goes into panic mode and goes, "Oh my God, we've sold too fast."
It's frustrating for everybody, isn't it? For the agent, the master broker, the developer. It's
the worst. It's the worst that can happen to an agent. Like it's happened to me, where the developer tells you, "Hey, we're releasing a product at the 5th of July, for example," and you're there the 5th of July at 10, but you can't get in until 12. Your client's waiting on the phone, and then by the time you access the sales office, it's like, "Sorry guys, the developer's paused sales."
Yeah.
You lose credibility towards your client. It's very frustrating.
Yeah, the agent caught in the crosshairs, but super disappointing for buyers. And then they'll sort of freeze the kind of the release and the launch, and then when they'll reintroduce it, the prices have gone up. What looks like at an exorbitant, kind of increase.
That's right. That's right. Also, talking about how developers control sales, they control sales by increasing price. So when you see a developer that launches 20 units for sale, sells 10, and then increases the price, what they're doing is obviously they're increasing price to match market price, but they're also increasing price to slow down sales pace. So the higher the price, the slower the sales pace. Yeah. What will happen is you'll never see a property price reduce. What you'll see is developer taking property inventory off the market and putting new inventory on the market at a lower price. That's how they do it.
Yeah. Any other mistakes or red flags?
Red flags. Okay. One of the really important things clients need to watch out for is making sure they deal with a developer that has all the right bank guarantees in place. Active bank guarantees, a special account in place, and also always, before entering any sort of reservation contract, making sure that the reservation is subject to due diligence done by the lawyer. Especially with the newer, smaller developers, you can get into some misunderstandings quite easily. Whereas with the big developer, it doesn't really happen, but it's always important to have a clause of subject to due diligence, so your lawyer can look into all the, let's say, the paperwork of the development before you enter into a bigger payment. Red flag is if they don't allow you to have that due diligence phase or stage.
This isn't a mistake or red flag necessarily, but it is something that, if a buyer buys within a specific development, the sort of the internal processes and procedures can be quite strict and stringent, and some people may not be approved for the actual purchase. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
So yeah, absolutely.
It's not a developer mistake. It's a problem within developments.
But it can be a developer mistake, because what happens now in Spain is the anti-money laundering prevention laws are very, very strict and specifically really targeted on developers in Spain.
Which is good.
Costa del Sol. Yeah, that's the good part. That's fine. Yeah. But the problem is Spain's very bureaucratic. So these developers, they subcontract the obligation of green lighting their buyers, and effectively that's the process of a external company. If you, Matt, come to me, to my developer's office, and you will buy this property from me, this company needs to greenlight you. So you're going to provide all documentation that proves the source of your funds is legitimate and that you're not laundering money. Once you're greenlighted, I can then enter contract with you. So the problem here is that developers use companies from Madrid that have zero idea of, what an international buyer sort of the documents. What I'm trying to say is they will ask you for documents which are relative to Spain, and they won't keep in mind.
Don't exist in the home country.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it becomes a very frustrating process for the buyer. We have loads of sales that actually fallen through at the PBC stage. So we try to set expectations clear from the beginning and tell our clients, like, you need to basically provide all this information and all this documentation. And if you don't, you won't be able to buy the property. Simple as that.
And those sales or clients that fall through is because it's such an exhausting process. They're just throwing the towel in the end.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, again, developer to developer, it varies widely. Some developers, it's a walk in the park. Others, you want to pull your hair out. I'll give you a practical example. I once had a buyer that had a donation from his grandmother, which was in a care home, and the passport of the grandmother was expired. So the developer would not greenlight them unless they had a new copy of the passport, right, to identify that party. And they had to take their nana out of a care home to get a new passport in order to get greenlighted. Like, that's how ridiculous it can be,
Should we move on to the next topic?
Yeah, let's go.
Okay, let's talk about advice for buyers looking at new builds. This is going to wrap up this video. So for someone watching this who's considering buying in a new construction or a new build property, what's your honest advice? What would you look for and what would you avoid?
I think you need to look for a reputable developer. No matter who you buy with, if it's a large developer or a small developer, look for someone that's reputable, someone that has a good track.
How can you tell?
Have a good track record.
You go online and most of the developers have a bad rap.
That's a really good point, Matt.
If you look at Google reviews online, it doesn't match the actual quality of the developer. So how do you get through? How do you cut through that besides maybe using an agency like High Homes to help you kind of navigate?
Talking about reviews, and that's a really interesting thing we never talked about on the channel, is that if you look for any developer in Spain and look for reviews, they all have terrible reviews. And the reason they do that is because they don't actively look for the positive reviews. So we've had clients that were buying with one developer, for example, in Estepona, and sent us a message saying, hey, I just can't find all these reviews online are terrible. It's like, yeah, because they don't actually actively go out there looking for the positive ones.
Speaking of being good at developing and not good at commercializing and selling themselves, that's a prime example.
Well, that's a perfect example. They're very good at developing property, but they're not good at selling. That's why they have master brokers. That's it's not their business. Their business is to build, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, I think a good piece of advice is, if it's the first time you come across a developer, make sure it's reputable. Check the reviews. I mean, obviously, you expect to see a lot of negative ones because of what we just discussed.
Ask your agency.
Ask your agency. That's a super important one. But also ask them to see things that they've done before. Like if you come to Kronos, for example, in Spain, and you want to buy a property in Bahia, which is what they're developing right now. Ask them if they've got a show home. Go and ask them if you can visit developments they've previously finished.
Track record.
When you walk into these developments, ask people how happy they are with the with the property, I think that's solid advice.
All right, guys. Well, if you found this video useful, drop your comments in the section below. Give us a thumbs up. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the YouTube channel. Hit that bell for notifications for all future videos. And once again, thank you, Kian, for all of your incredible insights. Appreciate it.
No problem, guys.
All right. Hasta luego.